There's a certain type of person who hears there's a party this weekend, and their first thought isn't excitement. It's relief when the plans get canceled. Not because they hate people, not because they're depressed, but because deep down they actually enjoy being alone. And here's the strange part. Psychologists are starting to discover that people like this aren't antisocial at all. In fact, their brains might simply be wired differently.
There's a very specific kind of person who hears someone say, "We should all hang out this weekend," and their brain immediately starts doing quiet calculations. Not because they dislike people, not because they're rude, and not because they're secretly miserable, but because somewhere deep inside their mind, a little voice says, honestly, staying home sounds better. Maybe with a book, maybe with music, maybe just sitting quietly doing absolutely nothing. And here's the strange part. To most people, that reaction feels suspicious. Society has trained us to believe that enjoying time alone must mean something is wrong. That maybe you're lonely, maybe you're antisocial, maybe you just don't know how to connect with people. But psychology has discovered something surprising. For some people, solitude isn't a problem, it's actually where their brain works best. And the difference between someone who enjoys being alone and someone who feels lonely is far bigger than most people realize. Loneliness feels like hunger. Solitude feels like breathing. One feels like something is missing. The other feels like finally having space.
Psychologists didn't always understand this distinction. For decades, anyone who preferred solitude was automatically placed into the same category: introverted, withdrawn, possibly maladjusted. The assumption was simple. Humans are social creatures, so anyone who prefers less social interaction must be struggling in some way. But then researchers started asking a different question. What if some people simply enjoy solitude? Not as an escape, not as a defense mechanism, but as a natural preference. In psychology, this trait is sometimes called unsociability. And that word sounds worse than it actually is. Unsociability doesn't mean hostility toward others. It doesn't mean avoiding people out of fear. It simply means someone feels comfortable with their own company. When researchers began studying these individuals, they expected to find warning signs: isolation, poor mental health, low life satisfaction. But the results were almost the opposite. Many people who preferred solitude were doing perfectly fine. Some were even thriving, which leads to an interesting question. What's actually happening inside the brain of someone who enjoys being alone? One important factor involves the brain's dopamine system. Dopamine is the chemical associated with reward and stimulation. For many people, social interaction triggers a big dopamine release. Conversations, laughter, group energy, it creates excitement. Extroverted personalities often depend on that stimulation. But individuals who enjoy solitude often have a slightly different threshold. Their brain reaches optimal stimulation much faster. Imagine it like volume control. Some people need the music loud to enjoy it. Others are perfectly satisfied with the music playing quietly in the background. Neither is better, they're just different settings. For people who enjoy solitude, too much stimulation can actually feel overwhelming. Large crowds, constant conversation, busy social environments. Instead of energizing them, it can feel mentally exhausting. Solitude becomes the brain's way of returning to balance. But there's another fascinating element. When someone spends time alone, a different part of the brain becomes more active: the prefrontal cortex. This area is responsible for reflection, imagination, planning, and complex thinking. When the environment becomes quiet, this region of the brain starts working harder. Which means people who enjoy solitude often spend more time processing ideas. They think deeply, they analyze situations, they replay conversations, and notice patterns others might miss. To someone watching from the outside, it might look like they're doing nothing, but inside their mind, an entire conversation is happening. Ideas connecting, questions forming, memories resurfacing. Psychologists sometimes call this an active inner world. And throughout history, many of the world's most creative thinkers relied heavily on solitude. Albert Einstein famously preferred long walks alone while thinking through scientific problems. Virginia Woolf wrote about the necessity of having a room of one's own. Nikola Tesla would sit quietly for hours, visualizing inventions entirely in his mind before ever building them. Solitude gave them something modern life rarely provides: mental space. And that space can be incredibly powerful. Because when the noise of the outside world quiets down, the brain finally has time to explore itself. But here's where things get interesting. Enjoying solitude doesn't mean someone dislikes people. In fact, many people who value their alone time often form deeper relationships. They may not enjoy constant social interaction, but when they do connect with someone, the interaction tends to be more meaningful. Instead of dozens of surface-level connections, they might maintain a few strong ones, and those relationships often feel calmer and more authentic. There's a reason for that. When someone feels comfortable being alone, they don't approach relationships from desperation. They approach them from choice. And psychologically, that makes a huge difference. Because relationships built from choice tend to be healthier than relationships built from fear of being alone. Think about it. When someone fears solitude, they may tolerate situations that aren't good for them: unhealthy friendships, unbalanced relationships, constant social obligations that leave them drained. But when someone enjoys their own company, they gain a certain kind of freedom. They know they don't need constant company to feel complete, so their relationships become something they want rather than something they rely on. There's also another subtle psychological effect that solitude creates: observation. When you're not constantly talking, you spend more time watching. You notice how people behave, how they react under pressure, how their tone changes depending on the situation. You start seeing emotional patterns that others might miss. This is one reason people who enjoy solitude are often described as thoughtful or perceptive. They're not distracted by constant social noise. Their mind has space to observe. And over time, that observation turns into insight. But here's something important to acknowledge. Solitude can sometimes be misunderstood. When someone prefers spending time alone, others might assume they're unhappy. Friends might say, "You should get out more." Family members might worry. But often that concern comes from misunderstanding. Because enjoying solitude isn't about avoiding life, it's about engaging with life in a different rhythm. Some people recharge through social interaction. Others recharge through reflection in quiet. Both are valid. Both are human. In fact, the ability to enjoy your own company may be one of the most valuable psychological skills someone can develop. Because when you're comfortable being alone, you're less afraid of silence. You're less afraid of your thoughts. You're less dependent on constant validation from the outside world. You become someone who can pause, reflect, understand yourself. And in a world that never stops moving, that ability is surprisingly rare. Think about how often we reach for distractions, scrolling through phones, turning on music, checking notifications, filling every quiet moment with noise. Sometimes it feels like we're afraid of silence. But people who enjoy solitude don't experience silence as emptiness. They experience it as clarity. And that clarity allows them to reconnect with something many people lose track of: themselves, their thoughts, their creativity, their emotional awareness. And when they eventually return to the social world, they often bring a calmer, more centered version of themselves with them, which might be the real psychological secret behind people who enjoy being alone. they've discovered something many people are still searching for: the ability to feel whole without constant distraction, the ability to sit with their own mind and not feel the need to escape it. And once you discover that kind of inner comfort, being alone stops feeling like isolation. It starts feeling like home. So if you're someone who genuinely enjoys your alone time, there's a good chance your brain simply thrives in that space. You're not broken. You're not antisocial. Your mind just finds energy in quiet places. And honestly, in a world that never stops talking, people who know how to sit comfortably in silence might understand something the rest of us are still trying to learn. But now I'm curious about something. When you spend time alone, does it feel peaceful or does it feel uncomfortable? Your answer might reveal more about your psychology than you realize. And if this topic resonates with you, there's a lot more about how the mind works that we're going to explore here. Because sometimes understanding your psychology is the first step toward understanding yourself.